dumped in a pauper's grave, still breathing faintly. A cowboy heard her gasp and gave her a marked stone of her own. The shovel was already in my hand when I heard it. Not a sound you'd expect from 6 feet of turned earth, so at first I told myself it was a dog somewhere or the wind coming off the ridge wrong. I set the shovel against the post I was mending, and I stood there. Listened. Dusk was coming in fast from the east, that particular yellow-gray you get in late October when the light quits instead of fades. I'd been working that fence line since noon and my lower back had opinions about it. Then I heard it again. A breath, ragged and thin, more like a catch than a breath, like something struggling to remember how. It came from the row of mounded dirt at the far end of the meadow that the county used for the paupers. No headstones. A few iron stakes driven in, some with numbers, most of those rusted past reading. 14, 15 mounds, maybe. I'd ridden past them 100 times without stopping because there's nothing comfortable about a place like that, and I'd never had reason. I crossed the meadow at a walk first, then faster when I heard it a third time. The second mound from the west end. The dirt there was loose and piled wrong, not settled and rained on like the others, but fresh, recently turned. The mound itself had a slight hollow in it right of center, like something underneath had shifted and taken the dirt with it. I dropped to my knees, and I started digging with my hands. My name is Calvin Prout. I'm going to tell you this whole thing, and it starts right there in that cold dirt with my hands going numb and my heart going somewhere I didn't expect. I'd been running the Harlan Kessler place for 3 years by then. Kessler himself had moved to Denver the winter before, leaving me as the sole hand on a spread that had been carved to about a third of what it once was. 47 head of cattle, 9 horses, a bunkhouse that leaked from 3 corners, and a main house I never slept in because it wasn't mine to sleep in. I had an arrangement with Kessler. I kept the place working, paid myself from the cattle sales, and sent him whatever cleared above that. He was satisfied. I was employed. It wasn't the life I'd imagined at 20, but I was 53, and whatever I'd imagined at 20 had long since been corrected by the world. I'd come to Harlan County the usual way for a man like me, drifting through on a job that ended, and finding that leaving again required more motivation than I had that particular week. That was 7 years back. The town of Cresswell sat at the bottom of a good valley, had a decent livery and a passable saloon, a general store run by a woman named Delphine Oakes who extended credit to people she trusted and spoke plainly to everyone else. There was a church and a school and a doctor named Fitch who was better at setting bones than he was at much else. But bones were mostly what the work out here broke. The pauper's field sat on the eastern edge of the Kessler property, on a strip of county land. It had been there since before Kessler bought the ranch. Nobody objected to it, including me. You live long enough out here, you understand that ground has to go somewhere for the people who run out of luck before they run out of time. I had no idea, that October evening, that I was about to become personally acquainted with the exact difference between those two things. Her name was Nora Vass. I didn't learn that for another 2 days, because when I pulled her out of that dirt she was past telling me anything. She'd been put in a pine box that was more gap than plank, and the box had cracked under the weight of the fill, and some amount of air had gotten in through that crack. Enough. Barely enough, but enough. She was slight, I remember that first, lighter than she looked. Dark hair matted against her face, a dress that had been blue once. She was wearing shoes with the heel worn off the left one, and her hands, when I found them, were folded across her chest the way someone else had arranged them. I carried her across the meadow to the bunkhouse, and I laid her on my bunk, and I built up the fire until the room was too warm, and then I sat beside her and I waited. Fitch was 12 miles away. The nearest neighbor after that was the Gunderson place, another 7. I had no way to send for anyone without leaving her alone, and I wasn't going to leave her alone. I did what I knew, kept her warm. Got water past her lips in small amounts once she could swallow, had to tilt her head just so, hold her neck, go slow. She had a knot above her right ear the size of a walnut, a bruise across her jaw on the left side going yellow at the edges. Her breathing evened out by midnight. Her color, which had been a kind of clay gray when I pulled her out, started coming back somewhere around 2 in the morning. I sat in the chair beside the bunk and I kept watch and I thought, somebody put her in that ground. Not a mistake, not an accident. The box was nailed shut. The hole had been dug and filled. Somebody did that to a living woman and either knew she was alive and didn't care or didn't check well enough to find out. Either way, I built up the fire again, and I watched her breathe, and I let the anger settle into something useful, the way you do when you've lived long enough to know that hot anger burns off and leaves you with nothing to work with. I'd need something to work with. She woke on the second morning. I was at the small table by the window eating cold cornbread when I heard the bunk creak, and I turned, and she was trying to sit up, eyes open, looking at the ceiling like it had said something wrong. "Easy," I said. "You've been out 2 days." She looked at me, dark brown eyes. Whatever she was calculating in that look, she was doing it fast. "Where is this?" she said. Her voice was rough from dryness and probably from breathing through a cracked pine box. "Bunkhouse on the Kessler Ranch." "I'm Calvin Prout. I run the place." I set the cornbread down. "You want water first, or do you want to know what happened?" "What happened?" No hesitation. So I told her, all of it, the sound, the hollow in the dirt, the crack in the box. I told her what condition she'd been in. I told her about the knot on her head and the bruise on her jaw. I told her I hadn't sent for the doctor because I hadn't been willing to leave her, but that I'd ride for Fitch this morning now that she was awake. She listened without interrupting, which is not how most people receive news of their own burial. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know who did it." I pulled the chair close and I sat down and I said, "Tell me." Her name was Nora Vass, and she had come to Cresswell 8 months before to work as a seamstress for a woman named Helen Carver, who ran the only dress shop in town. Helen had employed her fairly and paid her fair wages, and Nora had put enough by to start saving toward a small place of her own. She was 31, a widow, husband dead of fever 2 years prior, and she had the kind of careful, forward-moving quality that people develop when they've taken real losses and decided not to dwell. 3 months into her work at Helen's shop, a man named Dade Holcomb had come in wanting a shirt made for his eldest son's wedding. Holcomb was the largest landowner in the county, most of Cresswell in some form or another passing through his hands. He was 60, wide through the shoulders, with a way of speaking to people that suggested he had long ago stopped expecting to be refused anything. He'd taken notice of Nora. She'd been polite and professional and had made the shirt well and had not encouraged anything beyond that. Holcomb had come back a week later with another order, and another after that, and at some point the orders had stopped being the point. "He made me an offer," she said, "the kind where you're not really being asked." I said, "And you refused it." "I did." She said it flat, just that, not looking for validation, just reporting a fact. I thought, she's the kind of woman who makes a decision and then stands inside it, even when the weather turns. Holcomb had grown cold after that, then hostile. He'd spoken to Helen Carver, and Helen, who owed Holcomb for the building she operated in, had let Nora go. Nora had found work at the laundry, and Holcomb had spoken to the laundry as well. She'd managed a few weeks taking in mending work before that dried up too. Everyone in Cresswell knew who Dade Holcomb was and what it cost to cross him, and one by one the doors had closed. She'd gone to the county sheriff, a man named Poole, and Poole had told her he had no jurisdiction over a man's private business arrangements. He'd said it kindly, which she thought was worse than if he'd said it mean. "The night before you found me," she said, "Holcomb sent 2 men to the room I was renting. I don't know if he told them to kill me or if it went further than he intended. I don't remember much after the door came in." I sat with that. The chair was hard under me. The fire had burned down to coals. Outside the window, the morning was going gray and cold, and a wind was starting to move in the long grass beyond the fence line. I said, "The men, you know them." "Arlen Sykes," she said, "and a younger one I'd seen with Sykes before but don't know by name." I knew Sykes. Everybody in the county knew Sykes. He ran the sort of errands that Holcomb didn't want associated with his name. I got up and put more wood on the fire. I filled the water cup and brought it to her. I stood there while she drank, and I said, "You're going to stay here. I'll ride for Fitch now, and I'll be back before dark." "You don't have to." "I'm not doing it because I have to," I said. "Stay inside, bolt the door. The rifle over the doorframe is loaded." She looked at me, that same calculating look from when she'd first woken, but something different in it now, like she was revising something. "Prout," she said. Cal, a pause, "thank you." 2 words and she didn't dress them up. I appreciated that. I put on my coat and went and got my horse. Dr. Fitch came and looked her over and said she had a likely concussion, 2 cracked ribs he hadn't expected, and that it was fairly remarkable she was alive. He said it with the tone of a man who'd seen enough of the world to not be philosophically shocked by remarkable things, only professionally interested. He left her some willow bark preparation for the headache and told her to sleep as much as she could and eat when she could and stay warm. After Fitch left, I told her she'd sleep in the bunkhouse and I'd take the barn. She objected to this. I said, "You're in no condition to argue, and I'm not in the habit of losing them. Sleep." She almost smiled. It was the first time I'd seen anything like it, and it was small and brief and directed mostly at the ceiling, but it was there. I took my bedroll to the barn, and I lay in the hayloft, and I looked at the boards above me, and I thought about Dade Holcomb putting a woman in the ground. I thought about it for a long time. There's a particular kind of man I have no patience for, and I've met enough of them to have the type well established in my mind. It's not the violent ones exactly. Violence has its places, and I've been in those places, and I understand it. What I have no patience for is the man who arranges violence from a clean remove, who builds a life on making himself untouchable by making other people afraid, and who then, when somebody won't be afraid, responds not with confrontation but with cancellation. With erasure, with the casual decision that this person who won't comply simply needs to stop existing. Dade Holcomb had decided that Nora Vass needed to stop existing, and he'd had Arlen Sykes see to it, and then he'd gone home and probably slept fine. That kind of man depends on a certain arrangement of the world. He depends on everybody around him being afraid or obligated or both. He depends on there being no one outside that arrangement. I wasn't afraid of Holcomb, and I didn't owe him anything. That's a particular kind of freedom. I'd had it most of my life, usually because I'd never built up enough to be vulnerable to the Holcombs of the world, and I'd resented it sometimes. Lying in that hayloft, I thought for the first time in a good while that it might have a use after all. In the days that followed, while Nora recovered, I went about doing the things that needed doing. I rode to Cresswell, and I went to the county clerk's office, which was run by a nervous, precise man named Aldous Cree. Cree kept the records for every land transaction, every deed, every court filing in Harlan County. He and I had a passing acquaintance. I'd filed the quarterly accounting reports for the Kessler property through his office. He was not a brave man, but he was a scrupulous one, which is sometimes more useful. I asked him to pull the records on the Pauper's field internment from the previous week. He looked at me for a moment over his spectacles, and then he pulled the ledger. The entry read, Vass and female, approx. 3035, indigent, found deceased, rooming house, Cotter Street. Sheriff's notation, natural causes. Sheriff Poole's signature at the bottom. I copied the entry in my notebook. I thanked Aldous Cree. I walked out. Next, I went to the rooming house on Cotter Street, which was run by a woman named Mee Lindstrom. Mee was short and broad and had a face like weathered saddle leather and eyes that missed nothing. I introduced myself. I said I was making an inquiry about a woman named Nora Vass who had rented a room there. Mee Lindstrom looked at me for a long moment. Then she stepped outside onto the narrow porch and pulled the door mostly shut behind her. "She dead?" she said low. "No." Something moved in Mee's face. Not surprise exactly, more like a held breath getting let go. "I heard the men," she said. "Night before last from the accounts. I was 2 doors down. I heard the crash and I went to the door, but I didn't." She stopped. "I should have gone out." "Yes," I said. "But you didn't, and she's alive. I need to know what you saw." She told me she'd seen Sykes and a younger man, she knew Sykes by sight, as everyone in Cresswell did, carrying something wrapped in a horse blanket out the back. She'd told herself it was a rug. She'd gone back inside and told herself it was a rug for 2 days. "Will you write down what you saw and sign it?" I asked. "And then what?" "Then I take it somewhere it can do some good." She studied me. "You're the man from the Kessler place." "I am." "Holcomb owns Kessler's note," she said. "You know that." "Kessler knows that," I said. "I'm an employee." "Holcomb doesn't own my note." She went inside and she came back with a piece of paper and a pen and an inkwell, and she sat in the cane chair on the porch, and she wrote out what she'd seen and she signed it. Her handwriting was steady and clear. I took it and folded it carefully and put it inside my coat. I want to say something here about what I was doing because I've thought about it a lot since. It would be easy to make it sound like a plan, like I knew what I was doing and where it was going. Truth is I knew about 2 steps ahead at any given point. What I had was a direction and a reason and the particular stubbornness that comes from being 53 and having long since quit worrying about what things might cost. Men like Holcomb count on the fear of cost. The cost of speaking up, the cost of challenging the arrangement, the cost of being the one person who makes things difficult. They're not wrong that there's a cost. They're just counting on you to run the calculation and decide it's too high. I'd been running lean for so long that the calculation had a different result. I was 3 days into the riding and asking when Nora got well enough to be up. I came back one evening to find her standing at the small stove in the bunkhouse with a pot going and the smell of something with onion in it filling the room. She'd braided her hair. She'd found a canvas apron on the hook by the door and put it on over the dress she'd arrived in, which she'd washed and hung to dry and reclaimed. She looked at me when I came in. She looked at what I was carrying, the notebook, the folded papers, the map I'd started making of Holcomb's various properties and interests. "You've been busy," she said. "Some." I hung up my coat and hat. She ladled out 2 bowls without asking, set them on the table, sat down. I sat across from her. "Tell me what you have," she said. So I spread it out. Me Lindstrom's statement, Aldous Cree's copy of the fraudulent death record, 2 other statements I'd gathered, a man named Garrett Wills who'd seen Sykes's wagon heading east toward the Pauper's field on the evening in question, and an elderly woman named Pearl Oker who lived near that end of the Kessler meadow and had heard what she described as shoveling late, which she'd thought was odd but hadn't known what to do about. Nora listened and looked at each paper in turn. She handled them carefully, like she understood what they cost. "There's a territorial circuit judge," I said. "Harlan County's not his regular rotation, but he comes through every 3rd month or so. Man named Beaumont. I've never met him, but he's got a reputation for not being in anyone's pocket." "Pool is in Holcomb's pocket," she said, not a question. "Appears so. And Holcomb will know you've been asking questions." "He will." She was quiet a moment, and then she looked at me directly, not the calculating look now, something more settled, and she said, "Cal, this could go bad for you." "It could." "Your position here, the Kessler note." "Thought about that. And I thought about how to say it." "I've been working this land for 3 years," I said. "I've been working land like this my whole life, one spread or another. I've never once been the reason something got better. I've kept things running and moved on. That's a life, more or less. It's functional." I looked at the map on the table. "This is different." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You pulled me out of the ground." "I heard you breathing," I said. "That's just what you do." "Not everybody would." I didn't answer that. I picked up the papers and squared them against the table. "I'll need you to write out your own account," I said. "Everything from Holcomb's first approach through the night at the rooming house, as complete as you can make it. That's the center of it." "I can do that. And I'll need you to be willing to say it in front of Beaumont." "I'll say it in front of whoever needs to hear it," she said. The same flat way she'd said I refused it. The same quality of a decision already made, just being reported. I collected the papers and put them in order, and she collected the bowls, and we didn't talk much more that evening. But there was something in the room that hadn't been there before. Something that felt, approximately, like 2 people working in the same direction for the same reason. I hadn't had that in a good while. On the 4th day of the week that followed, Arlen Sykes rode out to the property. I was working in the near pasture when I saw him coming, and I took my time finishing what I was doing before I walked to the fence and waited for him. Sykes was a lean, dark-haired man in his mid-40s with a pleasantness about him that was entirely calculated. He rode right up to the fence line and stopped his horse and looked down at me. "Prute," he said, like we were acquainted. We weren't particularly. "Sykes, heard you've been asking around town." "I look for strays sometimes," I said. "Habit of the work." He smiled. It was a good smile, technically. "Mr. Holcomb's got a friendly interest in this property. You might know that." "I know Holcomb holds Kessler's note," I said. "Kessler's a grown man in Denver. I send him his accounting quarterly." "He's satisfied." "Well, sure." Sykes shifted in the saddle. "Mr. Holcomb was just curious whether you'd had any unusual visitors lately, out here being remote as it is." I looked at him. I let the silence run a bit. "Quiet out here," I said. That's what I like about it. He held the smile for another moment, then let it go. The pleasantness didn't go with it. What was left underneath was more accurate. Men who look for strays, he said, sometimes find themselves in bad country. I know my way around bad country, I said. He turned his horse and rode back the way he came, and I watched him go until I couldn't see him anymore. Then I went inside and told Nora that we should move the timeline up. She asked me that night. We were at the table again. She'd finished writing her account, 12 pages in her clear and careful hand. She asked me if I'd always been the kind of man who did this. I thought about that for a while. Define this, I said. Planted yourself between something and the thing trying to hurt it. I looked at the lamp flame for a moment. No, I said. Mostly I've been the kind of man who kept his head down and kept moving, less complicated. What's different now? I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to get it right. I think, I said finally, I'm just tired of the calculus. You spend enough years figuring the cost of things, what it'll run you to push back versus just let it go, and at some point, I stopped. You pulled a woman out of a box in the ground. After that, the calculus looks different. She was looking at me in a particular way, not the calculating look, not the settled look, something else, something that had a weight to it. I want to say something, she said. Go ahead. I've been thinking about what I'm going to do after this, wherever after this goes. She set her hands flat on the table. I don't want to leave Cresswell. I came here because I wanted to make something, a small business, a life, a real one. Holcomb took that from me for no better reason than that I wouldn't let him take something else. I understand that. I think I could start again, she said. The seamstress work, if Holcomb is dealt with and the town sees that things can change. She paused. What I'm saying is I intend to stay. Good, I said. I'm not asking your permission. I know you're not. A pause. I just wanted you to know, she said, that I'll be here after. I understood what she was saying, and I think she understood that I understood, and we left it there, which was the right place to leave it. Beaumont came through Cresswell on the 3rd Thursday of November. He was a compact man with a gray beard and the careful, unhurried manner of someone who'd spent decades listening to people in difficult circumstances, and had learned that most things reveal themselves if you give them enough room. I'd written to him 4 days prior through Aldous Cree's office, formal and precise, laying out the nature of the case and the documents I had, and requesting a meeting. Cree had passed the letter along through the territorial circuit network. Beaumont had sent back word that he would hear it. We met in Cree's office because it was the most official neutral ground available in Cresswell that wasn't under Poole's thumb. Beaumont sat behind Cree's desk. Cree stood to one side, nervous and precise. Nora sat in the chair across from Beaumont, and I stood behind her and slightly to the left. She told it plain. The whole thing from the start, the approach, the refusal, the work drying up, the night at the rooming house, waking up in the ground. She never raised her voice. She never asked for anything. She just reported what had happened in the order that it happened, and at the end she sat with her hands in her lap and waited. Beaumont looked at the papers. He read me Lindstrom's statement twice. He looked at the death record notation with Poole's signature on it. He asked Nora 2 questions, both of them precise and practical. How long from the moment she heard the door come in to the moment she lost consciousness, and whether she could identify Sykes unambiguously in a legal proceeding. She answered both without hesitating. Then Beaumont looked at me. You're not her husband. No, sir, I'm the man who found her. And who gathered all of this. Some of it, the witnesses gathered themselves mostly. They were there. They just needed someone to ask. Beaumont looked back at the papers. I'll need the sheriff for this, he said, meaning a sheriff other than Poole, meaning he'd send to the territorial capital for a marshal. This will take some time to sort correctly. Understood, I said. In the meantime, he said, looking at Nora, where are you staying? The Kessler Ranch, she said, Mr. Pruitt's property. It's not my property, I said. You run it, she said without looking back at me. Then to Beaumont, I'm not going anywhere. Beaumont looked between us. Something passed across his face briefly that might have been the suppressed version of a smile. I'd advise that arrangement continue for the present, he said. It took 6 weeks. A territorial marshal named Crane came in from Redfield. He was efficient and humorless and thorough. He arrested Sykes first, which was the smart move. Sykes, faced with the accumulation of evidence and the offer of a reduced situation, gave Holcomb up in detail. He didn't have much choice. The alternative was worse. Holcomb was arrested on a Tuesday morning. I was in the Cresswell General Store when it happened, and I didn't see it, but Delphine Oakes told me about it later. She said he'd gone very still when the marshal walked in, like something had stopped, like the whole mechanism of the thing he'd been for 60 years had just run down. Poole resigned before he could be removed. He left the county entirely, which was, in Delphine's view, the right call. I won't say Cresswell erupted in celebration. Towns don't work that way, not ones like this. What happened was quieter. People had known, most of them, in the way that you know things when you live somewhere long enough. They'd made their calculations about the cost of saying so, and they'd come out the same way year after year. When the calculation changed because someone else changed it, what you saw wasn't celebration. It was more like a long breath getting let out. Helen Carver came to find Nora 2 days after the arrest. She stood at the bunkhouse door, stiff and uncomfortable, and she said she'd made a mistake and she was sorry. Nora looked at her for a moment and then invited her inside and put coffee on. And by the time I came in from the pasture, they were talking about fabric suppliers in a way that sounded like a working conversation, not a grievance one. That was Nora. Holcomb's land interests were tied up in proceedings that would last longer than I cared to follow. What mattered for immediate purposes was that his hold on the local arrangements was broken. Cresswell went about reorganizing itself, as towns do, quietly and without ceremony. Kessler's note got bought by a land bank in the territorial capital as part of the proceedings, which meant I went from working a property held by a private note to working one held by a bank, which was not a dramatic change, but it did mean that Holcomb's pressure point on my situation was gone. I rode to Cresswell in late November, and I spoke to a man at the land bank's local office who had been sent to inventory the Holcomb holdings. I laid out what I'd been doing on the Kessler property for 3 years, the improvements made, the herd numbers, the accounting records. I made him an offer, a lease arrangement with an option, structured so that I could work toward actually owning a piece of it over time. It was not a complicated offer. He took it to his superiors in the capital and came back with a counter that was reasonable, and we agreed to terms. The first time I walked back into that bunkhouse knowing it was the start of something I'd eventually own. I stood in the middle of the room for a moment and just stood there. Nora was at the table cutting fabric. She'd converted half the bunkhouse. We'd worked out an arrangement where she took the main structure, and I finished out the old tack room at the back of the barn, which was actually a decent space once I insulated it properly. She had a seamstress work going out of the bunkhouse now, taking orders from Cresswell, and she had plans to rent a proper storefront come spring. She looked up at me standing there, and she read whatever was on my face. "Good news," she said, not a question. "Lease agreement," I said, "with an option." She set down the scissors. She looked at me a moment with a look I'd come to know over those weeks. Direct, warm, measuring things without being cold about it. "Sit down, Cal," she said. "I'll make coffee." I sat down. She made the coffee, and she set a cup in front of me, and she sat across from me, the way we'd sat at that table maybe 100 times by then, and she put her hand over mine where it rested on the table. "Good," she said, "just that." Her hand was warm, and she left it there, and I looked down at it, and then I looked at her, and she was looking at me the way she'd looked at me the night she said she intended to stay. Like she decided something, and the decision was made, and now she was just living inside it. I turned my hand over under hers, and I held it. I'm not a man who has words for moments like that. I never have been. What I know is that her hand was warm, and the coffee was strong, and the bunkhouse was hers, and the land outside was becoming mine, and those were the same fact somehow, the same event. Outside, the late November sky was going the color of gunmetal, and a first scattering of snow was coming down past the window, light and unhurried, settling on the fence line and the long grass and the meadow beyond. And somewhere out at the far end of that meadow was the row of mounded earth where I'd knelt in the dark and dug with my hands. I'd gone back there the previous week. I'd brought a piece of flat limestone I'd cut myself from the creek bed, and a chisel, and I'd carved Nora Vass, found living, October 1878, into the face of it, and I'd set it in the ground at the head of the second mound from the west end. She hadn't asked me to do that. I hadn't told her I was going to. When she found out, She found out because Pearl Ochre mentioned it to her in town. She'd come back to the ranch in the late afternoon and stood in the door of the barn where I was working and looked at me without saying anything for a moment. Then she said, "That was you." "Seemed right," I said. "You're not a number on a stake." She stood there another moment. Then she walked into the barn and she put her arms around me from the side, her forehead against my shoulder. And I put my arm around her, and we stood there in the smell of hay and horses and cold air coming in around the door, and neither of us said anything. That was enough. That was more than I'd expected from any piece of ground in a long while. The stone's still there. I know because I pass it on the fence line sometimes, riding the east boundary. It's been 2 winters now, and the limestone's weathered some, but the letters hold. Found living. Nora's shop opened in March in a rented storefront on the main street in Cresswell, the one that had been Helen Carver's. Helen moved her operation 2 doors down, and they do a reasonable business between them and get along without difficulty, which is its own kind of quiet, remarkable thing. I run the property. The herd's up to 61 head. The bunkhouse is hers. The tack room is mine, and I've made it comfortable enough, and the distance between the 2 buildings is about 40 feet, which is not very far at all. Last spring, early April, I was coming in from the north pasture at dusk, and I could see the bunkhouse window lit from the inside and the shape of her moving in the lamplight. I stopped my horse, and I just looked at that window for a minute. The light and the shape of her, and the sound of the land going quiet around me as the day came down. I'm not going to tell you I'm a man who deserves any particular good thing. That's not the accounting I keep. What I'll tell you is this. There is a woman in that light who knows every single thing I did that fall and has decided, with full information and her own free will, to be in that light instead of somewhere else. That's a different proposition than being deserved. That's the thing you spend a long life not quite believing is available to you. And then you kneel down in the dirt on an October evening because you hear something, and you find out you were wrong. The horse moved under me, ready for the barn. I let him have his head. We went toward the light.